My name is Myra Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, a cardiology resident, and a single mother raising 3-year-old twins on my own. 2 months ago, after a serious car accident, I was lying in an emergency room struggling with internal injuries while doctors worked urgently around me. My hands were shaking as I called my parents, hoping they could watch Lily and Lucas for just a few hours while my life hung in the balance. Instead, I received a message in our family group chat saying I was always a problem and that they were busy attending a concert with my sister Vanessa, telling me to handle it myself. In that moment, everything inside me shifted. From my hospital bed, I arranged emergency childcare at an extremely high cost and made a quiet but life-changing decision. I stopped all financial support I had been providing for years, including housing costs, insurance, and daily expenses I'd covered without ever being asked. 2 weeks later, someone knocked on my door, and before I tell you who it was and why it mattered, take a second to like and subscribe if this story resonates with you, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, to understand how it all began, you need to know what growing up in my family was like. In our house, love felt measured. My older sister Vanessa was always the favorite, admired for her looks and charm, celebrated for every dream she shared. When she said she wanted to work in fashion, my parents beamed with pride. When I said I wanted to become a doctor, my father simply said it was sensible. That word stayed with me. I pushed forward anyway, pouring myself into school, earning top grades, and eventually securing a place at one of the country's best medical schools. Years of relentless work followed, long nights, sacrifices, and constant pressure. The day I graduated as a doctor should have been unforgettable for the right reasons, but my parents arrived hours late, and in that quiet disappointment, I realized I had been strong for so long because I never felt allowed to need anything at all. "Sorry, sweetheart," my mother said that day, avoiding my eyes, explaining that Vanessa had an urgent meeting with a potential investor and they needed to drop her off first. There were no flowers, no dinner, no celebration, just a rushed photo in a parking lot before they hurried away because my sister needed emotional support. I later remembered how different it was when Vanessa held her first fashion show years earlier, when the entire family flew to New York, stayed in luxury hotels, sat front row, and filled social media with praise about her talent. I told myself the difference made sense, that fashion was unstable while medicine was secure, and that I didn't need the same level of care. What I didn't realize back then was that the imbalance went far beyond emotions and quietly became financial. It began 8 years earlier, right after I finished medical school, when my father called late one night saying they were struggling and asked if I could help with the mortgage just once. I sent the money without hesitation, believing it was temporary, but 1 month turned into years. Soon I was covering housing costs, insurance, repairs, and unexpected expenses, always telling myself family helps family. Even when I was pregnant with the twins and their father left midway through the pregnancy, I called my parents during a frightening hospital visit, hoping they would come, but they told me Vanessa was overwhelmed overseas and needed them more. They never came, not for the birth, not for the exhausting early weeks when I was caring for newborns while preparing for exams, yet the payments continued automatically every month. I kept a spreadsheet without knowing why, maybe because part of me needed proof of what I was carrying alone, and when I finally looked at the total, it was staggering, hundreds of thousands over 8 years. I never wanted praise or thanks, but I also never imagined being labeled a problem by the very people I had supported for so long. That realization arrived shortly after the accident, which happened on a Tuesday evening as I drove home after a long hospital shift. The light turned green, I entered the intersection, and a speeding truck ran through without stopping. The impact came from the side, the world spun, and everything went dark. When I woke up in the ambulance, pain radiated through my body as a familiar voice called my name, and I recognized a colleague trying to keep me awake while everything I believed about my family was quietly falling apart. I heard Marcus's calm voice telling me I'd been in a crash and that we were heading straight to the hospital because doctors suspected serious internal injuries and surgery might be necessary. That word stopped me cold because all I could think about were Lily and Lucas. I grabbed his arm and told him they were with the babysitter who was scheduled to leave soon, and when he checked the time he quietly said we had less than an hour. My hands shook as I unlocked my phone and called my parents, forcing myself to stay calm even as panic rose in my chest. When my father finally answered, his tone was rushed and irritated, and I quickly explained that I'd been in an accident and needed them to watch the twins for just a few hours. There was a long pause, muffled voices, and then the call ended without an answer. Seconds later, A message popped up in the family group chat from my mother, saying I had always been a problem and that they already had plans with my sister for a concert they'd been excited about for months, telling me to handle it myself. I stared at the screen in disbelief, and before I could even process it, another message came from my father telling me I worked in hospitals and shouldn't exaggerate the situation, followed by a laughing reaction from my sister. That moment settled everything I had spent years denying. Marcus noticed my expression and gently asked what they said, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Instead, I asked if I could borrow his phone because mine was about to die, and without hesitation he handed it over. I searched for an emergency childcare service, explained the situation clearly, agreed to the increased rate, approved payment and arranged instructions, all within minutes. When I handed the phone back, Marcus didn't say a word, but his silence spoke volumes. Before we arrived, I asked him to save copies of the messages, not knowing why, only feeling that I would need them someday. As I was taken inside and everything around me moved quickly, I realized the physical pain wasn't the hardest part anymore. Lying there, scared and alone, I made a quiet decision that felt strangely calm and final, one that would change the rest of my life long after the surgery was over. Doctors later told me that I'd arrived just in time, that the internal injuries were severe and a few more minutes could have changed everything, a fact that stayed with me long after the danger passed. I spent 5 long days in the hospital under constant monitoring, drifting in and out of sleep while nurses checked on me around the clock. Yet during all that time, there wasn't a single call, message, or visit from my parents or my sister. The emergency childcare service I hired turned out to be a blessing, coordinating perfectly with my regular sitter, keeping Lily and Lucas safe, well-fed, and calm, even sending me daily updates that reassured me more than I expected, and it hit me hard that complete strangers showed more care than my own family. On the 3rd day, I asked a nurse to bring me my laptop, ignoring her gentle suggestion to rest, because I knew something important needed to be done. I logged into my banking account and stared at 8 years of scheduled payments that had gone out without fail month after month, and with a calm I didn't recognize, I canceled every single one. Then I blocked my parents' and Vanessa's numbers not out of anger or drama, but because it felt like finally setting down a burden I had carried for so long it felt normal. Later that day, Marcus stopped by again as he had each afternoon, bringing coffee and quiet support, and when he asked how I was feeling, I surprised myself by answering honestly and saying that for the first time in 8 years I actually felt better. I knew consequences would come once the money stopped, but I wasn't prepared for how soon they would arrive. 2 weeks after I returned home, still moving carefully but grateful to be there, I was making pancakes for the twins on a calm Saturday morning, the kitchen warm and filled with laughter, when a sudden knock at the door broke the moment. My heart jumped as I walked over, unsure if I was ready for whoever stood outside, and when I looked through the peephole my breath caught because standing there was a tall elderly man I recognized immediately, someone I never expected to see on my doorstep. He had silver hair neatly parted, sharp blue eyes I remembered from childhood, and a presence that still carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades being listened to without question, and I knew instantly it was Grandpa Thomas, a man I hadn't seen in nearly 3 years because my parents always found a reason we supposedly couldn't visit. The moment I opened the door, he wrapped me in a firm embrace that made me wince, then pulled back to study my face, his gaze dropping briefly to where my hand rested protectively, as if he already understood more than I'd said. He told me calmly that Aunt Eleanor had explained everything, and before I could respond he stopped me and said there was nothing I needed to justify, but there was something important he needed from me. From his jacket he produced a formal invitation to his upcoming 70th birthday gathering, explaining that the entire family would be there and that there were things he intended to address openly. As he sat at my kitchen table watching Lily and Lucas play, smiling as they tugged at his attention, he remarked that they reminded him of me at that age, especially the stubborn chin, which made me laugh despite myself. When I asked how long he'd known about the imbalance in our family, his expression hardened just slightly as he admitted he'd seen it for years, explaining that a lifetime in the courtroom had taught him how to recognize favoritism and quiet exploitation when it appeared. Then he leaned forward and asked if I still had records of the money I'd sent my parents, and when I confirmed I did, he told me to organize every payment, date and amount because at his birthday celebration he wanted the facts laid out clearly, not as punishment or revenge, but simply as truth, which he believed always spoke loudest on its own. My hands shook slightly as I held my coffee, and the only thing I could manage to ask was what would happen if they turned their anger toward me instead. The ones who matter won't, Grandpa said, reaching across the table and squeezing my hand. And the ones who do were never worthy of you to begin with. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of quiet preparation. I printed every bank statement, every transfer confirmation, 8 full years of financial support, arranged neatly in chronological order and bound inside a plain manila folder. Seeing it all together was overwhelming. Month after month, year after year, a steady river of money flowing in one direction. Aunt Eleanor came by 3 days before the party. At 55, sharp-tongued and unapologetically honest, she'd always been labeled the family troublemaker simply because she refused to pretend everything was fine. She flipped through the pages slowly, her face hardening. $360,000, she said flatly. Do you realize what this is? I nodded. That's more than many people earn in 7 years, she continued, closing the folder. And they had the nerve to call you a burden. I admitted I didn't want to destroy the family, only to be seen to have the truth acknowledged. Eleanor rested a hand on my shoulder. You're not destroying anything. You're ending a lie. They built their comfort on your silence. You don't owe them that anymore. Still, my stomach twisted with dread. What if everyone sided with them? Some might, she shrugged. Families are messy. But your grandfather carries weight. And more importantly, you have the truth. That night, a text arrived from a cousin I barely spoke to. Vanessa says you've been acting erratic since the accident. I stared at the screen. The story was already being rewritten without me. I hadn't wanted a confrontation, but they'd clearly prepared one. The day of the party, I pulled into Grandpa Thomas's colonial estate, white columns rising over 3 manicured acres, the kind of place that radiated quiet authority. More than 40 cars filled the driveway. The entire family was there. Lily and Lucas pressed their faces to the windows, excited by the balloons and music. I wore a simple navy dress, professional, restrained. I wasn't there to cause a scene. I was there to tell the truth. The folder rested in my bag. Inside, champagne glasses clinked, a string quartet played softly and crystal chandeliers caught the light. And then I saw them, my parents by the fireplace, my father in his finest suit, polished and composed, looking every bit like a man who had no idea his foundation was about to crack. My mother stood in a cream-colored dress, laughing easily until her eyes met mine, and in that instant her smile vanished while my father's face stiffened as if bracing for impact. For a long beat, no one moved. Then my sister Vanessa swept in wearing a designer outfit that likely cost more than my monthly expenses, greeting me with a flawless smile that never reached her eyes and offering shallow concern about my accident. I looked straight at her and calmly said it had been serious and that I nearly lost my life, and while her expression faltered, she quickly recovered, brushing it off as if appearances mattered more than facts. As the party went on, the tone shifted. About half an hour later, while I was getting drinks for my children, I heard Vanessa speaking loudly to a group of relatives, carefully suggesting that I'd been acting unstable and cutting off my parents for no reason, with my mother adding tearful remarks about being worried for me. I felt the weight of curious stares and quiet whispers but stayed silent, focusing on my kids instead of defending myself. Aunt Eleanor appeared beside me and quietly confirmed what I already sensed, that they'd been calling family members for days, shaping a story to make me look unreliable before I could speak. Across the room, my grandfather watched everything closely, giving me a small, reassuring nod. Then the chatter faded as someone tapped a glass, and Grandpa Thomas stood, instantly commanding the room with the presence of someone used to being heard. Just as he began to speak, my father stepped forward, tension visible despite his controlled tone, insisting there was something the family needed to hear first, and in that moment it became clear that the truth everyone had been avoiding was finally about to surface. Grandpa lifted an eyebrow and calmly addressed my father by name, and Dad immediately turned to the room, putting on the familiar look of a worried parent, explaining that I had been struggling since my accident, growing distant, and cutting off contact without reason. My mother stepped beside him, voice shaking as she claimed they only wanted the best for me and that I'd been telling hurtful stories about being abandoned and unloved. Vanessa chimed in smoothly from across the room, insisting I was confused and even accusing me of spreading false claims about them refusing to help during my accident. The room went quiet, heavy with judgment, and I felt every eye on me as my daughter clung tightly to my shoulder, sensing the tension. An aunt approached with pity in her voice, asking if I was okay because my parents were so worried. Before I could answer, Grandpa's voice cut through the air, calm but firm, asking my father if he was finished. When Dad hesitated, Grandpa stepped forward, his presence steady and unmistakable, and said the family deserved facts, not performances. He acknowledged the picture they'd painted of me, then turned to my father and asked one simple question: who had been paying the house mortgage for the past 8 years? My father froze, tried to deny it, and glanced at my mother for help, but Grandpa produced the folder and explained that it contained a full record of monthly payments from my account covering nearly a decade. Gasps rippled through the room as Grandpa clarified he wasn't assigning motives, only laying out numbers, and as he began to explain just how much had been paid and for how long, Vanessa's face lost all color and the story my parents had been selling started to collapse in real time. Dad's fists were tight at his sides, and Mom looked like she might collapse. I held my children close, my heart racing as the full truth began to come out. Grandpa Thomas carefully opened the folder and began laying it out for everyone. 8 years of financial support, he said, and then he started reading the numbers. Mortgage payments alone totaled $230,400, the house Richard and Helen claimed they paid themselves. Health insurance bills added another $76,800, picked up by Myra when Richard's company dropped coverage. Car repairs, home maintenance, and emergencies came to around $45,000. On another page, contributions to Vanessa's fashion projects totaled $12,000. The grand total came to about $364,200. The room was completely silent. Aunt Eleanor stepped forward and reminded everyone that this was more money than most people earn in 7 years of work, and Myra had done it while finishing her medical residency and raising newborn twins alone. Mom's voice cracked as she said, "We never forced her." Grandpa looked at her calmly. "No one forced her. But in 8 years of all this support, how many times did you ever say thank you? How often did you visit her in the hospital after her twins were born? How many times did you actually show up for her?" No one answered. Mom's tears turned into full sobs, raw and shaking. "We thought she was fine," Dad muttered hollowly. Grandpa repeated firmly, "She managed because she had to. You taught her that her needs didn't matter." Murmurs of disbelief swept through the room. Then Grandpa held up his phone. "There's one more thing everyone needs to hear." He read slowly, his gaze on my parents. 2 months ago, Myra had a serious car accident. She was bleeding internally and rushed to surgery. From the ambulance, she called you both for help. Her children were at home with a babysitter who was about to leave. This is the message she received from Helen. "Myra, you've always been a nuisance and a burden. We have Taylor Swift tickets with Vanessa tonight. Figure it out yourself." The room erupted. Vanessa tried to defend herself, saying, "You're taking it out of context." Aunt Eleanor snapped, "There is no context. That is abandoning your daughter in a medical emergency." Dad shouted, "We didn't know it was serious." Grandpa's voice cut through the chaos. "Did you call her back? Did you come to the hospital?" Silence. The answer was clear. No, no, and no. Even a distant cousin shook her head in disgust and stepped away from my parents, leaving the weight of the truth hanging in the room. Several relatives quietly stepped away from my parents as the reality sank in. My mother was openly crying now, barely able to speak as she insisted she hadn't meant the message that way, that she was overwhelmed and upset. Grandpa didn't raise his voice when he responded. "You didn't think about what might happen to your daughter," he said calmly, "because you weren't thinking about her at all." He then turned to the rest of the room and explained that he wasn't demanding anyone take sides. He was simply laying out the facts, and what they chose to believe was up to them. Finally, he looked at me and gently asked if I wanted to say anything. I hadn't planned to. I expected the truth to speak for itself. But as I looked around at my shaken parents and my sister's forced composure starting to crack, I realized I needed to speak. I handed Lucas to Aunt Eleanor and stepped forward. I said I wasn't there for revenge or to embarrass anyone. I was there because for 34 years I'd lived inside a version of my family that wasn't honest. I had accepted the role of being the strong one, the dependable one, the one who never needed help. I believed them when they said Vanessa needed more support, and I believed them when they said I could handle everything on my own. But that night in the ambulance, frightened and desperate, something finally became clear. I wasn't valued for my strength. I was useful. I wasn't respected. I was convenient. No matter how much I gave, it was never going to be enough. As I spoke, relatives moved closer, offering quiet support. When my father tried to interrupt, I stopped him and said I didn't hate them, but I couldn't keep pretending this dynamic was acceptable. I couldn't keep paying for love that should never have required payment. When Dad asked what I wanted now and accused me of humiliating them, I told him I wasn't happy about any of this, but I wasn't sorry either. This wasn't about shame. It was about honesty. For the first time in years, the family was hearing the truth, not excuses or rewritten stories. When Vanessa tried to defend herself by saying families are supposed to help each other, I agreed, and asked where that help was when I was pregnant and alone, when I was raising newborns while studying, and when I was fighting for my life after the accident. She had no answer, and the silence said everything. I looked at my parents and made it clear. I wouldn't be sending them money anymore. Not because I couldn't, but because help in a family should come freely, not out of obligation, and it has to go both ways to mean anything. My mother reached toward me, pleading, "Pyra, please." I told her I wasn't cutting them off forever, but I needed real space, not a few weeks of guilt trips before everything went back to how it was. They needed to reflect on their actions, and maybe someday, if they truly acknowledged what they'd done, we could rebuild some trust. I took Lucas back from Aunt Eleanor and felt a sense of calm settle over me. A great aunt approached, holding my hands in her worn ones, apologizing for thinking I'd had it easy all these years. I told her quietly that everyone had struggled. That's just how it looked from the outside. That moment when I finally spoke up and chose myself felt like a turning point. Boundaries weren't betrayal, saying no wasn't selfish, and it was time my family and I understood that. After the party, my parents left early, silent and withdrawn, Vanessa following without meeting anyone's eyes. The quiet they left behind felt heavy but freeing. In the days that followed, relatives reached out to me. Cousins, aunts, uncles, apologizing, admitting they had believed my parents' version of events for years. The family chat where I'd received that hurtful text went quiet, then disappeared completely. My parents quietly stopped being included in family events. Michael's 40th birthday, Easter brunch at Aunt Eleanor's. They were simply no longer invited. 2 weeks later, my mother called from a new number, begging me to talk, saying everything had been blown out of proportion. I let the voicemail play once, then deleted it. Forgiveness wasn't a reset button. It was something for me to decide, not for them, and I wasn't ready to hand it over. But the financial impact was only just starting. About 3 months after the party, Aunt Eleanor called me. "They're selling the house," she said, and I set down my coffee cup, stunned. "What?" "My parents." She explained that they'd listed it last week because they couldn't keep up with the mortgage anymore. I should have felt something. Satisfaction, relief, even guilt, but all I felt was exhaustion. "Where will they go?" I asked. "Your Uncle Frank is letting them stay in his guest house for now," she said. "But it's conditional. They need real jobs, not just waiting for someone else to bail them out." I remembered they hadn't worked full-time in years. Dad retired early at 55, and Mom had never had a full-time job outside the home. They had grown completely dependent on my support without even realizing it. "What about Vanessa? Can't she help?" I asked. Eleanor laughed, though it wasn't warm. Vanessa had been struggling since her divorce. The story of the party got out, she lost a major design contract, and the last I heard she was waitressing part-time. I watched Lily and Lucas playing outside and whispered, "I don't want them to suffer." Eleanor's voice softened. "You're a good person, sweetheart. But they didn't suffer while you were supporting them, they didn't grow, didn't learn. Stopping wasn't cruel. It was necessary." She was right, and I knew it. That evening, I sat down with my new budget. The $3,200 I had been sending to my parents each month now went straight into a college fund for the twins. They would never worry about student loans, and they would never carry someone else's burden the way I had. That felt like justice enough. Then, 6 months after Grandpa's party, a call came on a Tuesday night as I was putting the twins to bed. An unknown number flashed on my phone. Normally I'd ignore it, but something made me answer. "Myra." Vanessa's voice was smaller, shakier than I had ever heard it. "Please don't hang up. I need to say something, even if I don't deserve your time." I sat down on the edge of my bed. "I'm listening," I said. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry for how I treated you, for the things I said, for laughing at that text when you were in the ambulance, when you were dying and I laughed. What kind of person does that?" She hesitated, then continued about the money. "I didn't know it was you covering everything for 8 years. How did I not know? Did you ever ask?" Silence. No, she whispered. I didn't want to know. I liked being the favorite. I liked how easy everything was for me. A bitter laugh followed. Nothing's easy anymore. I heard about the contract. Turns out your reputation actually matters in this industry. We sat quietly for a moment. Finally, she said, I'm not asking for money, and I realized this conversation was about far more than that. It was about truth, accountability, and finally seeing reality. She told me she wasn't asking for forgiveness, just that she finally understood everything, what she had been and what our parents had done. I took a slow breath and told her that understanding was the starting point, not the finish line, and that real change meant standing on her own and doing better. She said she was trying, her voice heavy with emotion, and I believed her. After we ended the call, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: quiet hope. A year after the accident, I stood in my new apartment watching the sunset through the windows. It wasn't large, just 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom and a small kitchen, but it was close to the hospital in a good school area, and most importantly, it was mine. No money flowing to people who never appreciated it, no hidden obligations, just rent, bills, and a college fund growing steadily for my children. Lily and Lucas were spending the afternoon with Grandpa Thomas, who had become a constant presence in our lives, picking them up every Sunday for small adventures and too much ice cream. Aunt Eleanor had become more than family. She was a trusted friend who helped me learn that setting boundaries wasn't selfish. She once told me she admired that I didn't become bitter, and I realized bitterness would only hurt me, not heal me. My parents were still staying with Uncle Frank, working modest jobs and getting by, and while I sometimes wondered if they reflected on the past, I knew that wasn't my burden anymore. For most of my life, I believed love was something you earned by giving more and asking for less, but I learned the hard way that real love isn't a transaction. It isn't a reward for being useful. The people who truly stood by me, my grandfather, my aunt, and friends who showed up when it mattered, did so without conditions, and that changed everything. They loved me for who I truly am, not for what I could do for them, and it took almost losing my life to really understand that. I don't know what will happen with my parents. Maybe one day they'll genuinely change, reach out with real remorse, and want to rebuild a relationship that's honest. If that ever happens, I'll consider it, but I won't wait around or let my life revolve around that hope. My life, my energy, my love, and my choices belong to me now. If the people who raised you see your self-respect as betrayal, maybe they never deserved your loyalty in the first place. To anyone carrying a burden that wasn't theirs to bear, it's okay to put it down. It's okay to prioritize yourself. You're not selfish, ungrateful, or a burden. You're finally free to live your life on your own terms. Thank you for following my story this far. If it touched you, please like and subscribe. It means more than you know. I'd love to hear from you.